Hello, and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy, a podcast where two mental health professionals talk about their mental health journey and how they navigate mental wellness while working in the mental health field. I'm your host, Jeremy Schumacher, licensed marriage and family therapist. And today I am joined by the owner and operator of Gem Therapy out of Madison, Wisconsin, Gabby Montana. Gabby, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I'm a little nervous, but also excited to chat.
Yeah, first podcast, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pretty exciting stuff. Really good intro to podcasts, and that I don't require any prep. My first question is always, how'd you get into the mental health field?
Yeah, so trying to make a long story very short, I'm a little bit of a younger therapist, so I just turned 27. And when I first went to college, I majored in, was supposed to major in professional writing and publishing. So I wanted to do English sorts of stuff. And then when I took an editing class, I realized, okay, fuck this. This isn't going to work out for me. And at the same time, I was also going through some personal stuff, and I was going to therapy myself. And I remember talking about this in therapy, and I was about, I don't know, 19 at the time. And telling my therapist, I think I might be interested in being a therapist, but how can I do this when I'm fucking up my life? And basically she told me that the people who get it the most make the best therapists. And I believed her. And so I then majored in social work with a minor in psych. Kind of just made my way through school very casually, and then decided to do my master's in clinical mental health counseling. And that was a 3-year program. And then I got my LPC. So yeah, I think I wanted to be in English because I really enjoyed words and just the feeling that they elicited. And then I kind of realized I can do that without reading, and I can actually do it with people in front of me. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I got to where I am, and just own personal experience and then family experience and a bunch of other fun stuff in the mix.
Yeah. I love the idea of the people who get the best are the people who have lived it. I think that's very accurate. I think it's interesting, your fascination with words, because I relate really strongly to that. I was straight psych in school, but both my parents at various points in their careers were English teachers. And so I'm a super word nerd. The type of therapy I do is collaborative language therapy. I love the idea of the words we use create our meaning, and that's how we can have new meaning in our lives and have new insights and change things. So I relate to that a lot. I love too that we don't have to edit live while we're in therapy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, the longer I'm a therapist, the more I realize one word that has an objective definition means subjectively so many different things to so many different people. And it's just a lot of subjective meaning making.
Yeah. And so you work with anxiety, and somebody could come in and say, oh, I'm anxious. And we all kind of collectively know what anxious means, but what it looks like in their specific life is totally unique.
Right.
Yeah, I love that. I think I see that a lot with neurodivergence. It's one of those, any diagnostic, and we can shit on the DSM while we're having this conversation, but all the diagnostic criteria and that approach to mental health, there's so much variance in it. And so, I use ADHD as an example all the time. There's 20 diagnostic criteria, you need 6 of them. And so the number of different iterations you could have to get the same diagnosis that has no overlap with somebody else who has the same diagnosis is crazy high. And I think there's even more variance with things like anxiety or depression. You work with people pleasing. There's so many ways that can look, and yet we're going to use the same word or phrase for it.
Exactly. Yeah. It feels like a lot of this stuff is on a spectrum. And some people, for people pleasing, for example, is more subtle, and other people, it's a lot more explicit.
Yeah. How did you, let's talk, I'm just going to stay on the business side of things just for a minute here. Um, you and I first connected, we had both taken some coursework around building your own practice is how we first connected. And so I'm curious, because you are a little bit of a younger therapist, what it's like for you, Ben, to build your own practice earlier in your career. Was that something that people recommended? Was that something that you knew coming out of school you wanted to do? Kind of how did that process look for you?
Yeah, so I graduated with my master's when I was 23. So that was pretty young. And I didn't have the best internship experience, which was at community mental health. And throughout my whole internship class, I was like, I'm not doing that. I'm going to do private practice. Like, I just have to work for myself. And then I think I was just like kind of in survival mode at that point and like not really understanding like the amount of money it takes to build a business. And so
Mm-hmm.
when I actually did graduate, I did go into community mental health, but I was fortunate enough to find a place that, one, paid me fairly well, and two, kind of operated like a private practice to some degree. And I really enjoyed most of the people that I worked with. And I stayed there doing mental health and substance abuse therapy for about a year and a half. And then some leadership changes happened, and I was like, I'm going to go ahead and transition out of here. And then I went to a group practice. And I, always knew I wanted to eventually go solo private practice, just didn't know when I was going to do that. And when I went to the group practice, the money was decent, but then again, I ran into some like misalignment of values, and there was some money stuff happening, and I wanted to, take the leap and do my own thing. And so I think I turned 26 when I fully launched my practice. And I think a lot of the narrative around it was stuff about like, you need to take insurance, you need to get more experience. If you don't take insurance, like you're a bad therapist, that sort of stuff. I think from other professionals, which is really sad, is where I got the most judgment. In regards to like what school taught me, and again, I'm trying to give them the benefit of the doubt because I was definitely in survival mode at that state. Like I was just like getting through it. I know they did like some workshops on private practice and like briefly talked about it in classes, but I don't necessarily remember if it was like, hey, you can do this if you want to. This is how you make it happen, and this is what it can look like, and we really want to support you in doing it. So yeah, that, I don't know if that answered your question, but
yeah, for sure. I think, and I relate a lot. I graduated, I was a young student for my class in high school. And then I graduated college in 3 years. So I had my master's at 22. And so like, I've been doing therapy since I was 21 years old, like my first, that first internship placement where I got to actually do therapy. But I am a bit older than you. And so like that idea of grad school, like there's no benefit of the doubt for me. Like we didn't talk about private practice. We had one project of like, build your ideal practice if money wasn't an issue. And it was like so divorced from reality of like how this actually works that I would say it wasn't useful at all. But yeah, the profession itself kind of has this, I would say there's an old guard for sure, but it's still transitioning towards like being like, right, there's a mental health crisis, like help people how you can help people. I got definitely a similar amount of pushback about not taking insurance, as if like not taking insurance is like an ethical lapse. And it's like,
right. Yeah.
and it's not like, it's a thing that you have to struggle with. Like I came from working at a homeless shelter is one of my internship sites. I worked at a low fee clinic back before everybody had to have insurance with the Affordable Care Act. Like that's how old I am. So like the idea of missing people because they can't financially afford it still is somewhat bothersome, but also doing agency work, doing private practice for years as part of a larger group, like insurance is not like some sort of magical solution either. It causes its own headache for people.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I personally struggle with like outside of my professional life is chronic fatigue. And when I thought about doing my private practice, I was like, oh my gosh, how can I actually maintain a business, do the work that I want to do it effectively, and also handle the headache of insurance and knowing the risks
Right.
of potentially not having like secure income because of clawbacks or denials or like whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And depending on what you're working on, like the more niched your clientele are, the potential for like not getting reimbursed. Like I'm a marriage and family therapist. And so the longer I do couples therapy, which sometimes takes a long time, like
Mhm.
the less likely it is insurance wants to reimburse me. They want to reimburse 8 sessions, 12 max, and then they don't want to pay anymore. And it's like, you're not
Yeah.
getting paid to fill out insurance paperwork. You're not getting paid to like talk on the phone with someone who has a bachelor's degree and explain why this is taking longer and longer. So it's like
Mhm.
you're spending so much time not getting paid and also like not helping your clients.
Right. Exactly. And you know, maybe it's more of my younger generation, but I have no desire to do free labor, no matter what career I'm in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's definitely, I've talked about that a lot, especially people who go through the social work side of things, and how there's like a predatory nature around like you have to like earn your stripes. You have to like deal with some bullshit in the profession before you can like move out on your own. And like it's just super unhealthy. I'm sure it exists in other professions, but like I don't think it's the norm in other professions.
Right. And I think I've heard on one of your previous podcasts, like talking about how when you're the youngest in your career as a therapist, you're working with some of the most extreme cases. You probably
Right.
need people who are more further along in their career, but our field is not going to appropriately compensate people with that experience. And then, I mean,
Right.
I remember, and of course, I have like empathy and understanding and perspective for these situations, but being such a young therapist and having clients like yell at me and swear at me and say like things that were so like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do with this, and like not having the appropriate support.
Yeah. Yeah. And in some of those settings, like I interned with a homeless shelter. Like I joked about like I'm doing mindfulness for people who need to figure out how to get on food stamps. Like that mindfulness is good and helpful, but like there's a difference between like the resources that the people needed versus what I was offering. And like that wasn't their fault. It wasn't my fault. It's just like the system isn't set up to support that. And we're throwing young therapists who don't have necessarily like the wherewithal or even the knowledge of like a referral base.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and like you're in Madison, I'm in Milwaukee. Like my referral base fluxes a lot, but like if somebody texts me like, "Hey, I need a psychiatrist," like good luck. I wish I had someone I could give to you, but like, so again, it's this disconnect between like the work we do as therapists and what people need. Often are like resources that aren't what we're offering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. And I was fortunate enough that, well, yeah, I'm to some degree fortunate that at my first job outside of my master's, they did have case managers. So I had some access to like
Sure.
knowing where to refer and like support people who needed resources that I had no idea existed. But
Yeah.
even then, it wasn't enough, and
Yeah.
probably still isn't enough.
Yeah. I think too, it's interesting. There's a bit of a theme. I don't know if I keep accidentally finding people who have similar stories to mine, but like often the little bit of the push you need to go out and start your own practice is working with somebody who either is doing something that's like ethically not great or like doesn't align with your values. I've heard a lot of different stories from people of like, and then like there was a change in leadership and I didn't like it. And like that was the push I needed to go do my own thing. So it sounds like you had a little bit of that as well.
Yeah. And I think one of my core values, just like as a person and as a professional, is authenticity. I'm a pretty blunt and like upfront, direct person. And when I'm in an environment that's not authentic or like not showing up honestly, it is unbearable for me to be there.
Yeah.
And I think that really hit home for me at my last job, and really pushed me to take the leap and do something that I was absolutely terrified to do, because I was just like, I cannot stand to be here a second longer. Um,
Yeah.
and it was terrifying and also one of the things I'm most proud of.
Yeah. I know too, and this is maybe the most I'll put someone on spot on my podcast. I said I would be easy because I'm your first podcast, but I know you also had to do a name change throughout starting your own practice.
Yes. Yeah. I think this was something that so when I first filed for my LLC, I was doing it for a group practice because I was going to be a contractor. And so at that point, I was like, does my name really matter? I'll just, do what I always thought I would do. And when you file for the LLC, at least in Wisconsin, it'll tell you if it's the exact same name, but it won't tell you if you use one word that is trademarked. And so I had no idea to look for that. So I filed my name, and then I think it was about like 6 months in, I got a letter, a cease and desist, notifying me that like I had taken somebody's trademark, which of course I didn't intend to do. And so I had to navigate that situation, and I sought professional help like through a lawyer. And I was like, I'm more than happy to change things. I just had no idea, and it all worked out. And so I changed my name to Gem Therapy, which someone had told me that they thought Gem stood for like I did like crystals and stuff, but it's just my initials. So my full name is Gabrielle Elise Montana. And so I was just like, well, let's just go Gem Therapy.
Yeah. It's there are two things that I love about that story is like, one, right, like coming up with a name for your practice is oddly difficult because all the like therapy type adjacent names are pretty much taken. And so even if it's not in your own state, somebody could still file trademark about, so it's like not even just Wisconsin.
Right.
And I get like going through the LLC process, it is like just through Wisconsin, but like trademark isn't limited to that. So like all these things that you might be like, this is really great, it's values aligned for me, or like I do collaborative work, so let me do like collaborative count. Like, nope, all those, every iteration you could think of for that is taken. And so, yeah, I think in the last couple of years, a lot of people have just started using their name. Like my practice is wellness with Jer, which I have some regrets on because not everybody understands how Jer is short for Jeremy, but like, that's fine. But like, yeah. And then, so you like build your practice for like 6 months, and then I'm sure your heart drops when you get a cease and desist in the mail,
Oh my
which
gosh.
is scary.
Yeah, it was, I felt so defeated. I remember that day too, because I was like in the middle of like getting over like being really sick. And then I went to my office and I got this letter, and I'm like, oh, what is this? Like, and then I opened it up and I just like sank. But I gave myself space to like have some feelings about it. And then I was like, okay, we can problem solve this. It's not an issue. Have somebody to delegate to, which were my lawyers. And now I'm actually filing for my trademark, which I didn't realize takes like a really long ass time. So I think I filed in the beginning of the year, and I probably won't hear back until the end of this year, early next year, if the trademark goes through.
Sure.
But yeah, it all worked out, and it was really stressful in the moment, but we're all good.
Well, and it's interesting because, right, like without having a ton of training in our schooling around business or some of these, like it's a lot of trial and error and like learning from your own mistakes, or like if you happen to listen to a podcast or catch like some therapist who's gone through the process, they might say like, hey, don't do this. Cause like I remember hemming and hawing for like days on like, am I an LLC? Am I an S corp? And am I a sole proprietor? Like I didn't know what any of those words meant, let alone like if they were a good fit for me or not.
Yep, I can totally relate to that. And I did so much Googling and like looking up shit on Instagram and like TikTok. And then I came across Allison, where we met in the party. And that gave me so much guidance in figuring all of my stuff out, as well as just like connecting with other people who had done it already. And a lot of it was just like failing and struggling and then picking myself back up and continuing to do it anyways. And now I feel like I'm kind of in this space where like for the most part things have stabilized. I've been in my solo practice for a little over a year now. And so I'm feeling pretty good about it.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I saw on your website, I was prepping. I do a little bit of prep. You have one slot open right now, so like filled up, even with a name change, like and having to redo your branding, like weathered all that stuff, and are doing well in private practice, which I think is awesome. Like I know for me, being values aligned, having a work schedule that like I'm fully in control of. Like
Mhm.
you talked about dealing with like some health issues and chronic fatigue. Like for me, I have two little kids, so like having a schedule where I'm like, nah, like I'm going to take Wednesdays off, or like
Yeah.
I need a day just to do paperwork, or I need a day just to do my marketing or my business side of things. Like getting to do that is super awesome.
Yeah. And I think I've learned over the years that I'm somebody who has a little bit of rigid thinking. Um, and in regards to what I think is the right way to do something, trying to work on that a little bit. But in regards to my business, I don't think I could ever let anyone else have control over it. Because I'm like,
Yeah.
my way is the right way and it's efficient and effective and it works.
Yeah. Yeah. I am opposite of rigid, being neurodivergent with ADHD, but like have a very specific way. And like it doesn't
Mhm.
need to make sense to other people. It makes sense to me. And so like the way that it works for me is just like how my ADHD brain is like, is how we're gonna do it.
Yep. Yep.
Um, Circling back to some authenticity, you advertise like your niches as anxiety and people pleasing. Like,
Mhm.
is that kind of similar to what you're talking about before, like lived experience, or was that like you kind of found I work really well with this clientele, or is something like you're passionate about? Kind of how'd you get into those specialty areas?
Yeah. So I would say that I definitely have lived experience with anxiety and depression and attachment trauma stuff that I didn't really know what it was until I started to do some of my own deeper work. I primarily do a lot of trauma work, but what I found is that a lot of people will say they have anxiety, and then the more we dig into that, then it leads into the trauma. Um,
Yeah.
and so I I started therapy fairly early. I probably went when I was like 14ish, and I did not have a good experience. But when you're that age and you don't have anybody in your life to tell you any different, I kind of thought it was the same as like when you go to a PCP, you just like get who you get and like that's it.
Yeah.
Um, and so I really hated it. And then I went to college and had some like relationship issues. There was some mental health stuff going on in my family. Um, and I needed an emergency session. And so I called up the clinic I would typically go to, and my therapist that I didn't really enjoy, but thought I needed to go to, wasn't available. And so I had to go to
Hmm.
somebody else. And I remember that first session like it was yesterday. Um, because I remember sitting there and being like, wow, this person like actually gets it. And I didn't realize that like, oh shit, like this is what it's supposed to be. Like this is what it's supposed to feel like. Um,
Hmm.
and so then I ended up working with that therapist for about 6 years until I moved to Wisconsin. And a lot of the stuff that we did was more like CBT oriented, like reality choice therapy, which was what I needed at the time for things like anxiety and depression, where I don't think I was in a space where I understood what was underneath all of that. And I really just needed like
Yeah.
concrete stuff to like pull me through. Um, and so then when I moved to Wisconsin, I was starting my career, realized I wanted to do some deeper stuff. I do brain spotting. I wanted somebody who did brain spotting. Um, and so over the last couple of years, I've done more of that like deeper somatic core belief work. But long story short, going back to that personal experience, I think I still continue to experience like generalized anxiety, which has gotten better over time, but I feel like I'm just a naturally anxious person, which is why sometimes I have that rigid thinking of like,
Sure.
this is the right way and it needs to be done this way. Um, I feel very fortunate that like depression has gotten a lot better over time, but a lot of the things that drove me to therapy were like interpersonal relational issues that I didn't really understand. Um, and I would have these like really big reactions to in the moment. Um, and then be like, why did I do that? Like, why is this happening?
Hmm.
And so, in that way, without going into too much detail, I feel like it drove me to want to help people through the stuff that was showing up in their lives in that way.
Yeah, for sure. And I think most of the people who listen to the podcast are therapists, but for those who aren't, let's talk about brain spotting a little bit. Like, how'd you kind of come across brain spotting and get into getting certified to work with that?
Yeah, so I think it was my it was my third year of grad school. So I was like in my internship, and another student had done a training, and we worked in a position where we got some credit towards a training. And then in brain spotting, if you're a grad student, you get a discount.
Sure.
So I got it like dirt cheap. And I was like, well, I'll do it and see what happens. And that was the same time that COVID hit. And so it was supposed to be an in-person training. It ended up being online. I had no idea what to expect. Again, I was in survival mode during grad school, so I want to give them the benefit of the doubt, but I don't remember getting like effective training on like working with trauma, or some of like, stuff about attachment, and just like experiential therapies. And so when I did the brain spotting training, I learned a lot of things that I didn't either hear or hadn't like fully processed. And I remember the first time they did a what's it called? Not an example, but practicum. They did a practicum on the online training with one of the people who were there to receive the training. And when I watched it, this person had like a really big somatic experience. And I remember thinking like, no way, this is real. Like, this is fake.
Yeah.
Like, they're kind of like making this up. And because it was the first time that they were doing a virtual training because of COVID, they didn't have it set up where we could do practicums. We just had to watch. And so after that, I was interested, but I didn't practice it because like, I don't want to do something that I haven't experienced. Like I don't want to do it with a client yet. And so then when I went to my first job, my supervisor was actually trained in brain spotting. And so we would set up meetings to practice it, and I would experience it, and then I would practice with her. And I remember the first time I experienced it, I was like, what the fuck just happened? Because up until that point, like I said, I was doing more like CBT, reality choice theory based approaches in my own personal therapy. And ever since I had my first experience, I was like, I need to keep doing this. So that's when I started pursuing my own individual therapist who would do brain spotting with me, which I still do my own work that way. And then I started doing more trainings in brain spotting. So I'm trained in phase 1, phase 2, brain spotting parts. And this September, I'm going to be doing brain spotting couples for co-regulation. And then I'm working on my certification right now, which is just like consultations with the trainer. And so after I had my first experience with it, I just never turned back because it woke something up in me that I wasn't willing to turn my back on.
Sure. And I think through your personal experience, like I think that highlights a lot of things. Like grad school does not do a good job. Hasn't for years of prepping people for how to work with trauma. I think it's a thing most of us are aware of. It exists, but we don't get really any formal training. Psychology, psychology is about 20 years behind where the science is. And I would say like grad school's even further behind on like training people. So we'll see, maybe in like 10 years, it'll catch up. But too, like brain spotting I'm going to see if I can offend both people who do brain spotting and the EMDR crowd. Brain spotting is like a less janky version of EMDR, I feel like.
Go ahead.
It's a little less formalized. It's a little bit more, I'm not trained in it. So I'm a little bit trying to summarize for lay people of, it's not like you need a ton of extra equipment. It's not so formal and structured. It's a little bit more about you and your therapist building it together. But definitely get into some of that somatic, like not subconscious, but like just body aware work of sometimes your body's doing things that your brain isn't aware of, or that your brain's doing without you being super conscious of it. And so trying to get through some of that stuff and dig into that and see what it's about.
Yeah. And I'm not trained in EMDR, and I've never personally done EMDR, so I can't really speak to that. So I know it is similar, but like you said, less structured. And,
Yeah,
if you do just phase one of brain spotting, all you need is, some headphones for the bilateral music and your pointer. And then obviously the
right,
therapeutic relationship and holding a dual attunement frame. And then when you get into phase two, the only extra equipment you get is just some goggles where you practice like brain spotting with one eye.
yeah,
And that's something I really do appreciate about it is I think they, and I know some of the, science behind it, but my brain cannot comprehend that sort of stuff. But it's very simple in my experience.
yeah, yeah. And I think once you start working on you start. I don't want to overgeneralize too much. When you spend time in the field, like you start to see a lot of these diagnoses are labeling symptoms, but aren't really getting to a root issue. And for a lot of
Right.
people, and I do overgeneralize. I've written and done videos on like everybody has trauma,
Mhm.
and big T trauma and little T trauma, but like this idea of there's stuff going on often where like there's dysregulation in our body, and whether that's just in our brain or that's in our brain body connection, having a way to work through some of those things, like CBT is super helpful for being functional, but
Mhm.
CBT might not get to like processing old stuff or having like a healthy lifestyle. It just might keep you functional. And for somebody who's pushing towards like healthy and happy, like contented, like there might be more to it. And so I think having that ability to kind of say like, okay, what's like going on underneath this? We're not just treating symptoms, but we're actually trying to like create health and wellness. I think
Mhm.
that's a different approach. And so a lot of therapists then like do what you're doing, which is like going and getting training and like level 1, level 2, level 3, like adding
Yeah.
these things because we don't get it in grad school. And like the more time you spend around a diverse population of clients, the more you're like, right, like I don't just want to treat symptoms.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think a lot of it too is the training is absolutely for my career and it's also for myself. Because I think again, I'm younger, so I'm also feeling like I'm in this stage of like really trying to figure out not necessarily who I am, but who I want to be and how I want that to look and like what sort of work I want to do in regards to like personal healing journey. Um,
Hmm.
and I've just found myself gravitating this way. And that's just what works for me. And I also understand
Yep.
that brain spotting doesn't also click with everybody. And that I don't see it as the end all be all.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that it comes up a lot. I work with religious trauma. So, like, advertise a specific subset of my practice is towards trauma. And so, I have a
Mhm.
lot of people who've come through EMDR and they either love it or they hate it. And, like, I don't see a lot of middle ground. And I think with a lot of the somatic stuff, it probably comes back to like personal body awareness. Like, some things like EMDR are really intensive. And if it doesn't feel great, it doesn't feel great. Some things like brain
Mhm.
spotting, even though it's maybe less janky, is in my words.
Yeah.
Than EMDR. Like some people don't like it. Like I do a lot
Mhm.
of DBT stuff. I do a lot of like body work. People don't always like that stuff. So like
Mhm.
it's just figuring out that like you don't have to do everything for every client. Like if there's something that you resonate with and you can be passionate about and do really well, that's great. But that also might not
Mhm.
be for every single client.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I definitely, I do a lot of feedback informed treatment. And so checking in, like, how do you feel about the work that we're doing? And was there
Hmm.
anything that felt off base and do we need to adjust? And if someone says like, this isn't working, I'm not going to force them to keep going that way. Right. We'll,
Right.
check in and see like, maybe you need something more structured. Maybe you like CBT. And let's do that. I have great respect for CBT because I know what it did for me. Do I love
Yeah.
it? Not always, but I respect it because it saved my life when I needed it.
Yeah. Yeah, I can talk trash about pretty much every style of therapy, like because there isn't a perfect one. Like if there
Yeah.
was one, everybody would be doing it, but they all have pros and cons, and so it
Mhm.
really like that's where the fit of your therapist um, comes in because you have to have somebody who's a good personality fit, and then the way that they're practicing therapy also has to fit for you. Um, What was it like with brain spotting? Because you learned it throughout COVID, and I know you're licensed in Florida as well. Like, how is it doing something like brain spotting virtual?
Yeah, so every person is different. So I always thought I was somebody where like if I'm going to therapy, I have to be in person. And then obviously I couldn't. And I
Hmm.
actually prefer brain spotting virtually. And I think the
Okay.
reason for that is because I like that I'm closer to the pointer. Versus when you're in a therapist office, like depending on how it's set up, that their chair might be too far away and I don't know, the distance doesn't work as much for me. I like when my therapist, my pointer is like right there. So I
Yeah.
actually prefer the virtual. But I have plenty of clients who say like, I don't like it virtually. I just want to do it in person. And when I do it in person, I have a like a rolling chair in my office. So I'll ask my clients like, is it okay if I get, this close to you? And I show them where I would
Yeah.
sit. And as long as they say it's okay, then I'll sit, close enough where the pointer is going to be effective for them.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Let's talk about people pleasing a little bit, because I see this a lot well, I see a lot in general. I
Mhm.
do couples work as a
Yeah.
marriage therapist, and then I do religious trauma, and like it's a huge, huge, huge. I often highlight people pleasing as one of like the most common symptoms of religious trauma, um, that people just aren't aware of. And you mentioned this earlier, and I want to go back and highlight it, that like most people don't come to therapy being like, I have trauma, please help. Like
Mhm.
it's showing up and in some other way, and it's affecting them, but most people aren't aware that like this is trauma.
Right.
So
Right.
how do you kind of see the people pleasing, and what do you how do you kind of approach working with people around that?
hmm Um, so I think a lot of times it comes out in the initial phone consultation. The way
Hmm.
that, people write in saying like what they're hoping to work on and the way that they say it. And then when we get on the phone, the way that they're describing things. Um, and depending on if it feels okay, I might name that over the phone and say, like, it sounds like this is happening. And like, this is some of the work we might be able to do. I also do a pretty thorough like intake the first session, not in a like too structured way where it's like, you know, too professional, but enough where I'm getting that background information and can start mapping things out while building a relationship. Um, and as they're, one of the questions I ask is like family of origin. What was it like growing up? What was your childhood like? And like interpersonal relationships. And as they answer these questions, I might name some of the things that I'm hearing. And a lot of times this is like people who have an anxious attachment.
Yep.
And so there's a lot of fear of abandonment, getting lost in the mix, getting left behind, fear of failure, that sort of stuff. And because those core beliefs or core fears are activated, it results in, well, I will do what I need to do. I'll fawn, right? Do what I need to do to just get by in order to protect myself from the potential of what could happen. So that looks different for everybody. And like I said earlier, like it can be very explicit. And sometimes it can show up in more subtle ways where they're like, I guess I would have never thought of it that way. But you're right, it does feel like I'm just doing this because I don't want to lose this person or I don't want to lose this thing that exists in my life.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. And fawn, I like to highlight, like, we know fight or flight as trauma
Mhm.
responses. Some people, hopefully most professionals, but most even lay people are aware that freeze is a third option. But fawn is
Yeah.
another option where you're really like trying to work through, you're trying to respond to somebody else's emotions, which aren't under your control, but you're trying
Mhm.
to limit any potential negative fallout or feedback that you're getting from that person by setting aside your own stuff to make them happy,
Mhm.
which like is crazy making, because we can't control other people's emotions.
Right, right. And so a lot of the way that I work through that is obviously we talked about brain spotting. I do a little bit of parts work and I like to use emotionally focused therapy, which some of that I feel like is similar to parts work. Um,
Hmm.
and so just depending on the client, depending on their history, I like to go back to the family of origin stuff, like being a kid and start there. But obviously not everybody feels that that's their truth or that that is true for them. And so again, it's like following the client, meeting them where they're at.
Yeah, for sure. um transitioning here a little bit. You're very open on your website about being a therapist who swears.
Yeah, I hope it's okay that I've sweared on here. I've like said quite a
Yeah,
few
for
words.
sure. I'm not big enough yet to have sponsorships that I have to worry about. I love that. I think like definitely got there at that point in my career, but like didn't start out that way. A lot of the pushback and feedback I got through school was that I was not professional enough. And wearing like a Hawaiian shirt, a Batman shirt, Batman in Starry Night. It's a little bit of culture mixed in, pop culture and classical art. Long hair, big beard, like and I hated that feedback I got of like, you're not professional enough, because when I was showed up as myself, as my authentic self in the room, it felt so much better. And it seemed like the therapy worked better. So I'm guessing like maybe not that professional feedback, but similar for you, like authenticity is really important. And so being able to say like, I say shit and I say fuck, and like we're going to talk about how like sometimes life's just fucked up. And like being able to use that language, I think, is important.
Yeah. And I think part of that too is, well, obviously, like I said earlier, like authenticity is, one of my most important values. And I know that that's what I would have needed. Like when I was younger, if I would have, not had the original therapist that I had started with, but somebody who was willing to just like, this fucking sucks. What do we want to do about it? Right. Like that would have been so much more well received for me. And like, that's just who I am as a person too. This is the way that I talk in my therapy sessions, the way that I show up in my therapy sessions is about the same way that I show up in my personal life. I'm a human before I'm a therapist. And so it's really important for me to just be my authentic self, because I feel like in graduate school, I didn't necessarily get that explicit feedback about being professional, but I feel like it was this implicit message of like, this is what you need to do. And if you don't, then you're probably not very good at your job. And it created so much anxiety for me. And I felt like I was always failing. And I felt like I was always being this imposter, because I'm trying to be this prim and proper professional. And I have to wear certain clothes when I go to my internship. And that's not me. And it distracted me. And it kept me from being present in the room, versus like now I probably wear the same 3 outfits like interchangeably throughout the week, which is literally leggings and a crew neck. And I don't sit properly. I sit crisscross applesauce in my chair, or I'll put my foot on my desk and like kind of prop myself up because I'm a little shorter. And my clients don't even notice. They don't care. And I'm not distracted because I'm comfortable. And I'm not distracted and worried about failing because I'm just showing up as myself. And so not only does it make me feel more comfortable, but I feel like the work that I do is significantly more effective than any work I've done before I could set my own rules for the way that I wanted to work and show up.
Yeah, I remember I got it a lot in grad school, and then I went to my internship, which I luckily had a really good internship placement. And one of my supervisors wore slippers to session. And she was just like, I don't know, my feet get cold. And if my feet are cold, I'm distracted. So I'm going to wear slippers, because like it makes me like wearing slippers makes me a better therapist. And I just remember like really wrestling with this like idea of like, this supervisor gets me, and like I want to do therapy like they do. And like then like all this feedback of like, you're not professional enough for this, like clients are going to work with you. And like it's comical at this point in my career, like how many people want to work with me because I don't seem particularly proper. And so
I agree with that.
I love your website. Just being like, yeah, I fucking swear. Like
I feel like just, putting it out there right away, because that way the people who don't want that, they can just, exit out of the website, and they can find somebody who might better meet their needs. And then the people who need that, they know where I'm at.
They can go find a therapist who wears a suit and tie, or the classic female therapist, like 3 layers of sweaters. Awesome. I always like to ask, both professionally and personally, like what's on your bookshelf, or what are you watching? Like what are you kind of consuming in your free time?
Yeah. So when I first started my practice, I was doing a lot of reading, and I kind of took a break for a while because I feel like I was like overdoing it, needed to be more present in my life. But I I recently picked back up, I think it's called CPTSD From Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker, I think is who wrote it. So I'm a little over halfway through that, and I'm just finishing up that book right now. And I'm not sure if I'm gonna pick up another book right away. I might still give myself space to take a break. But personally, I don't really do any other like reading for fun. I used to do that a lot as a kid, and I feel like my interest has really shifted. Now, when I do enjoy reading, it is more professional based. And then when I want to take a break, I'll give my attention to something else.
Sure.
So yeah, I'll finish up that book and then we'll see.
Yeah. What does self-care look like? I know like you mentioned earlier, like some chronic fatigue. And then I know we talked about like structuring your time is owning your own practice is really nice. So like, what do you kind of do working in this mental health field, working with people who have trauma, which can often be really heavy stuff? How do you kind of take care of your own mental well-being outside of the therapy room?
Yeah. So I'm actually really proud of myself for this, but and long story short, I had COVID last year and it really did a number on me where I've always had exercise-induced asthma, but after that, I developed more chronic symptoms and now I'm on these other inhalers and it made my chronic fatigue worse and I was having breathing issues. And so I finally decided to explore some more holistic approaches. So I go to a naturopathic doctor, which has significantly helped my not just my chronic fatigue, but also the COVID symptoms more than the traditional medical setting has. And I've also been doing, I'm not sure if it's a holistic approach, but I don't know anything about chiropractics. I just know that it's it's not like cracking, it's called network spinal analysis. And so I've been doing that with somebody who's also in the Madison area and just have been like physically making my health a priority, doing those things, which is not something I've really ever done before. I mean, I was really into like lifting weights and exercise for a long time before COVID hit. But I never really like focused on some of the other stuff that would really benefit me, like some of the stuff I'm learning about through my naturopathic doctor. And I've slowly been getting back into lifting weights and exercise, which is something I actually do really enjoy, but I had to put on the back burner. So that's what self-care has been looking like for me recently, just like actually making myself a priority. And then outside of that, it's really, I just like to turn my brain off. And so like laying on the couch, hanging out with my dog, like really not doing anything has been really beneficial. And as my health gets better, I do want to focus on like, doing more adventurous sorts of things. But as of right now, I'm just kind of focusing on getting my energy back.
For sure. Yeah. And I love that. I think self-care, we often think of like going for walks or exercise or do yoga or meditation. And like we miss a lot of things like sleep hygiene or like, feeling good physically, like taking care of your body. Like your brain is part of your body. And so if your mental health is going to be good, taking care of your body is actually important. And I feel like it sounds so obvious that it either just gets skipped or people like aren't making a big enough deal about it. But yeah, I think that stuff's great. Like I spent the past year for not even probably like 20 months has really for me been about like sleep hygiene because I don't sleep well. And just being like, obviously this is impacting me. Like I talk to my clients about it all the time and that I just think like I'm a special circumstance where it won't matter. So yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And I think that's a really good reminder for people of like, right, like if you're having chronic fatigue or if you have back pain or like some of those things like can show up in the room with you. Like if you're not feeling good, it's going to be hard to do good therapy. And so prioritizing that, not just so that you can do good therapy for yourself,
Right.
but I also think modeling, like I think I love being able to talk to clients like, yeah, there's stuff that I'm working on in my personal life too. Like there's things that like you're not a finished product and that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And, therapy like is also big on that list too, like continuing to do my own personal work, which I think obviously we're biased, we're therapists, but I think that's something that will always be on my schedule for me, no matter, how things look in my life. It's just something that I really value. And it feels like a space to put me first.
Yeah, for sure. Gabby, this has been awesome. If people are interested in finding out more about you or working with you, where do they go? How do they find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on my website, which is, what is my website? gemtherapyllc.com. And I also post on TikTok a little bit, and my username is therapy by Gabby. Not too active on there, but there's some past videos, or if you're interested in like brain spotting, I have a more in-depth video on that. So those are the two main spots that you can find me.
I did Google gem therapy and something about crystals came up first, and then
Yeah.
you're like third on the list. So you do have to. I put Madison in to get the results. We'll have your website and socials linked in the show notes so people can find it. Gabby, thanks again for agreeing to come on. This was awesome. How was the first podcast experience? Gonna put you on the shot on the spot while we're still recording.
Yeah, no, it was great. I really enjoyed it. I still have a little bit of like nervous energy going on, but I feel like it went really well, and you're a great host. And so I appreciate the opportunity to be on here.
Yeah. It was really good. So thanks for coming on, and to all of the listeners tuning in, thanks for checking out the show. Once again, we'll be back next week with another new episode. Take care, everyone.